The rebuilding of the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis that I have just discussed in the first part of this lecture, it was the first of a string of building projects in the regions surrounding Paris that resulted in a whole series of grand Gothic cathedrals. This is Notre Dame de Chartres, there we go. That is situated about 80 kilometers southeast of Paris. And as is very often the case, the present church has multiple predecessors. At least 5 cathedrals have stood on the site before the present one. The earliest may have been erected as early as in the 4th century. It burnt down in 743, and then in the following, it was rebuilt, and then in the following centuries, wars and fires repeatedly demolished the existing structures that then had to be rebuilt anew. And the present west front of Notre Dame de Chartres, Our Lady of Chartres. Notre Dame is French for Our Lady. So the Virgin Mary, it's a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. One of the first cathedrals in France to be dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The present west front of the structure belongs to the cathedral that was built after a fire in 1134. The new church was completed around 1160, and then in 1194 a new fire broke out and demolished everything except the west front, which survived. So what we see today is a combination of 2 construction projects that are separated in time. The west front dates to 1134 to 60, and the structure east of the west front, the rest of the church was built from 1194 to 1220. This is the plan. Notre Dame de Chartres, Our Lady of Chartres, has a 3-aisled nave and a transept and a 5-aisled chancel. There is an ambulatory and 3 apsidal chapels that radiate eastwards. And it's vaulted with ribbed vaults that are quadripartite. They are divided in 4 sections. You may remember from last week the Durham Cathedral in England, that was begun in the late 11th century, and where we find among the absolute first ribbed vaults in Western Europe in the nave. And they in Durham are 7-partite. In Chartres, 1 century later, the building technology had advanced to a point that made it possible to reduce the number of crossing ribs, the load-carrying skeleton, to reduce the number of crossing ribs to 2, so as to make the vault seem lighter, as if it is floating high up in the air. And same as in Durham, the ribs that carry the vaults, they run down along the columns in the nave arcade. They go all the way down to the floor. This emphasizes the vertical upward movement in space. It leads the eye upwards toward the height under these floating, soaring vaults. The interior height of Chartres is 37 meters or 123 feet. Chartres' claim to fame above all else is perhaps the stained glass windows. There are in all 167 stained glass windows in the cathedral. It's the most complete group of stained glass windows that survive anywhere from the Middle Ages. And the window that you see to the right on the screen now is from around 1180. It is set in the west front, and that was a part of the structure that survived this fire in 1194. So this is a stained glass window, one of the oldest stained glass windows in the cathedral. We see the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. They are seated frontally, looking very, very solemn, very majestic. The Virgin Mary is crowned. The Christ child, raises his hand in a blessing, and they are surrounded by angels who adore this celestial mother and child. This very majestic, impressive rendering rendering. It changes a bit in the 13th century. As we can see in the north rose window set in the north facade of the transept, the north rose window. It's called a rose window because it's circular like a rose. This representation or composition is slightly more animated than in the 1180 stained glass window. The Christ child is now seated on his mother's left arm. It's not totally symmetrical, but she's still very regal. She's crowned, she holds a scepter. And the mother and child are surrounded by angels in the panels closest to the circular center, and then the square panels in the next, like, concentric circular frame holds Old Testament prophets. And this is a way of creating, in visual terms, a typological argument that says that all the scriptural prophecies in the Old Testament by the prophets were completed and fulfilled in the birth of Christ. And the central circular panel is framed by white lilies, which is a symbol for Mary. And if we look further down, the 5 windows beneath this central circular rose window shows the 4 windows, 2 windows on each side, show Old Testament kings, King David, King Solomon, and priests, Melchizedek and Aaron, 2 Old Testament kings and 2 priests. And then the central window holds an image of Saint Anne with the Virgin. So it is the mother of the Virgin, the grandmother of Christ, Saint Anne, who holds her daughter, Virgin Mary, on her left arm, same as the Virgin Mary in the center of the rose window holds the Christ child on her left arm. And Anne also holds the white lily, the Mary symbol, in her hand instead of the scepter, or corresponding to the scepter that the Virgin is holding in the rose window center panel. So this whole window, you could say, is about Mary. And quite fittingly, appropriately, since as I said, the Notre Dame Cathedral is one of the first churches or cathedrals in France dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The remainder of the windows in Chartres show multiple biblical scenes, of course, from the Old and from the New Testament, and saints and symbolical motifs. And there are also a series of smaller windows where we actually see common people of the 13th century. Depictions of craftsmen who are busy building the church and making the sculpted decoration of the church. And also money changers, which wasn't really a very respectable trade in the Middle Ages. So to the left, there are carpenters who are raising the or constructing the roof trusses, the roof structure of the cathedral, and below, the picture below shows masons and sculptors. The masons are at work on the walls, and the sculptors, they are making 2 statues, one of a royal saint and one of a bishop saint. And these statues that we see being made in the glass window, they correspond to actual sculptures that adorn the porches of the Chartres Cathedral today. And these glass windows with craftsmen, they may be pious donations, maybe they were paid for by guilds, organizations of the craftsmen as pious offerings to the church. And such donations by craftsmen who were involved in the enterprise of building a church, such donations are known from other contexts. We have no written sources that confirm that this was the case, but it might just well have been the situation. So far, we have stayed in France. That was where the first Gothic churches were built, and apparently the medievals themselves perceived of Gothic architecture as a specifically French style. I said at the beginning that the Gothic architectural style was referred to as opus Francigenum, as French work in the Middle Ages. But it soon spread, the Gothic style or the Gothic manner of building soon spread from the Paris region to other parts of Europe. And a very good example of the concrete circumstances for a change in style from Romanesque to Gothic. The circumstances for that are exemplified in the case of Canterbury, the Canterbury Cathedral in southeastern England. That was also ravaged by fire. The existing Romanesque cathedral burned down in 1174. I've already spoken at length of Abbot Suger's writing on the rebuilding of the Saint-Denis Abbey Church, and I said that it's exceptionally rare and unusual to have an account written by someone who was involved in an artistic enterprise, which it is. And it is all the more fantastic that we have yet such a source from the same century, from the 12th century, that describes the rebuilding of a cathedral. It's written by Gervase, who was one of the monks at the Canterbury Cathedral. And the text by Gervase is included in the course readings for this week. It's a super fascinating document. That's why I wanted you to read it. Gervase starts his account with a fire, and he describes how sparks from a fire elsewhere in the city of Canterbury, they were carried by the wind. And no one noticed how they caught hold under the roof of the cathedral. They smoldered and finally set fire to the wooden roof beams, and the entire eastern part of the cathedral, including the choir, burnt down in one night before the eyes of the despairing monks. This is a good explanation if you have been asking yourselves, how can cathedrals, stone structures, huge stone structures, how can they burn? The reason is, as Gervase tells us, that sparks caused either by lighting perhaps, or being carried by the wind from another fire, catches hold under the church roof in the wooden beams, the trusses, the wooden structure that carries the roof. And if it catches fire for real, the wooden beams, they burn and they break and they fall down into the interior of the church. This happened in Paris. Was that 2019? That was 6 years ago in Notre Dame de Paris. Exactly that happened. It was a spark, I think, from electric installations that set fire to the roof beams. And that almost ruined the whole church. It was saved in the last minute, and it has taken until now, actually, to rebuild it. I think it was opened again just this spring. That was just a terrible night to witness. In April, it was witnessing how Notre Dame de Paris almost burned to the ground. And this is what Gervase describes as well. The despairing monks saw this happen, and in Canterbury, and the entire eastern part of their beloved cathedral was ruined. But it was rebuilt, and this is what Gervase describes in his text: the task of rebuilding the destroyed eastern section. After the fire in 1174, it was first given to a French master. Obviously, that's where the novelty of Gothic architecture in France had been developing. This master, Guillaume de Sens, led the reconstruction of the very long choir, and that I have marked with 1 on the plan here. But then he fell from the scaffolding and hurt himself so badly that he had to return to France. And in 1178, that was after 4 years, 1178, he was replaced by an Englishman, William the Englishman, who completed the work. He continued he finished the apse, and also he finished the chancel or the choir that Guillaume de Sens had started, and then he continued building the apse, which is 2 on the plan, and the so-called corona, the circular martyr chapel, number 3 on the plan. And the apse and the corona, the martyr chapel, held shrines with the remains of Thomas Becket, who had been Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was murdered in 1170. So that was just 4 years before this fire. And Thomas Becket, he became venerated as a martyr, and the shrine with his remains and a smaller shrine with his scalp were located in the apse and in the corona. And this rather original or unique tapered shape of the choir is due to the fact that the new construction, the rebuilding of the church, took into account the remains of the choir section of the previous church, the one that had burned down in 1174. I have tried to indicate that on these two plans of the Canterbury Cathedral before 1174 and after 1174. So when the outlay of the new church was laid out, it followed or respected the plan, or the ground plan respected, you could say, the layout of the previous Canterbury Cathedral. And this is something that Gervais explains very pedagogically in his text to us. So this is the choir, the first part that was rebuilt under the direction of Guillaume de Sens. The photo here is looking west from the altar, from the stairs leading up to the altar, looking west. I should add, by the way, that the western part of Canterbury Cathedral, the nave, the Canterbury Cathedral has two transepts, and the western transept and the western nave, they are late medieval additions to the Gothic structure from the 14th and 15th century. So I won't take them into account now in class today. So this is Guillaume de Sens' choir, looking west then, towards the late medieval additions to the church, the building structure. The ribbed vaults here, we have the by now familiar pointed arch ribbed vaults. They are 6-partite. So this is an indication that this structure is slightly older than the one in Chartres, where we have the quadripartite vaults. So the later the church, the fewer ribs in the vaults, you could say. And then after Guillaume de Sens, William the Englishman took over when Guillaume de Sens had to go back home, and William the Englishman, as I said, was responsible for the raising of the apse and the circular martyr chapel, the corona, and they look like this. The apse is also called the Trinity Chapel, and then the corona in the easternmost end of the church. So all this took 10 years, and we can follow the development of the proceeding of the rebuilding year by year, thanks to Gervais. He uses the terminology of his time, so his account is not always easy to follow, but I wanted to include it anyway for you to read, because it's such an amazing text, and it's written by someone who really tries to explain what he sees. So in contrast to Suger, it does make an effort to describe the structure and the technicalities behind the new architecture. So a summary of his chronicle is that in the first year after this devastating fire, French and English artificers, experts, were summoned, but they differed in opinion on what to do. William of Sens, among those experts, was hired on account of his lively genius and good reputation. And in the first year, preparations and demolition of ruin building parts took place. Then in the second year, the rebuilding started with a choir. And I have indicated now on the plan number, or the years, the second year, the third year, the fourth year, the fifth year. In the second year, 3 pairs of columns were erected in the choir, this long section, and the side aisles were vaulted. In the third year, the choir was completed up to the crossing where the transept and the choir meets. And it was vaulted, and also the crossing was vaulted. That's where the 3 is on the plan. In the fourth year, William of Sens continued, the building continued east from the crossing. We're still in the choir. 5 pairs of columns were erected and the side aisles were vaulted. But then in the 5th year, he fell. William of Sens fell from the scaffolding, and he remained for a while heroically directing the work from his sickbed. So the choir east of the crossing, that's the 4 on the plan still, was vaulted, but then he had to give up and go home, and William the Englishman replaced him and finished the work on the choir in the 5th year. And the crypt beneath the Trinity Chapel, the work on the crypt, which is the kind of a lower church or the basement of the Trinity Chapel, the work on the crypt was started in the 5th year. And in the 6th year, the work on the crypt continued, and in the 7th year, it was finished, and the exterior walls of the Trinity Chapel above the crypt was begun. In the 8th year, the work on the Trinity Chapel continued, and the corona, which is called tower by Gervase of Canterbury. When he speaks of a tower, it is the corona, the circular martyr chapel he refers to. That was begun in the 8th year. In the 9th year, work was stalled because there were no money, lack of funds, which is also something that happens frequently. These large building enterprises took decades, and part of the challenge was to collect enough money for these huge enterprises. And then finally, in the 10th year, the Trinity Chapel and the corona were completed. So Gervase ambitiously tries to explain as best as he can what happens and the principles behind it. And he also, I think that's wonderful, he's like an art historian. He stops, or he kind of interrupts his account by explaining what is different, how the new structure is different from the previous building. And this is what the points that he makes. What is new? This is my summary of Gervase's explanation of what is new compared to the old structure. The interior columns are more numerous, he says. They are taller and they are made from marble. No marble columns were in the church before 1174. Here there are innumerable ones, he says proudly. The capitals of the columns are exquisite in sculpture. In the old church, the capitals were just plain, undecorated. In the new church, they are of exquisite sculpture. The vaults are arch-ribbed, and they have keystones, and the keystone is the central stone that kind of locks the ribs into place. I have indicated that with an arrow, a red arrow. And there are no partition in the new choir between the vaults of the crossing and the choir. The vaults converge in one central keystone, so the whole space is open and continuous. The whole space is covered by stone vaults instead of the previous painted wooden ceiling. And there is, I interpret Gervase when he says that there was a single triforium in the old structure. Here are 2. I think that he refers to the 3-story elevation. Let's see. Yeah. When he speaks of triforia, I think he refers to the gallery and the clerestory in the choir. The 3-story elevation consisting of the arcade between the central nave and the aisles, and then above the arcade, the gallery, and then the topmost story, the clerestory. This makes for a 3-story elevation. Now, the apse, or the Trinity Chapel, was the place of the main shrine of this martyr that I mentioned before, St. Thomas Becket. He had been murdered 1170, so just 4 years before the cathedral burned. And he was murdered, shockingly enough, in the cathedral by 4 followers of the English king, Henry II, who was an enemy of his Archbishop, Thomas Becket. Thomas had opposed the king's attempt to gain more influence over the church's affair. The king intervened in the election of bishops. He wanted to reduce the independence of the church and weaken its ties to Rome, to the Pope in Rome. And Thomas opposed all this. So they were not on good terms. It's uncertain if King Henry II actually ordered the murder of Thomas Becket, or if it was something that his men, these 4 men who actually performed the deed, if they just thought that they heard the king asking for the murder of Thomas Becket. But in any case, they broke into the church, Canterbury Cathedral, and they attacked Thomas while he was leading the evening prayers before one of the altars. And they killed him by cutting off the top of his skull. And that was a completely shocking thing to do. To kill a bishop, an archbishop, is bad in itself, and then to do it in the church and while he is performing liturgical services, that's just the most terrible thing you could do, basically. So Thomas Becket, he quickly began to be worshipped as a martyr, and large numbers of pilgrims came to Canterbury to pray before the shrine in the apse. And what you see here are 2 animated or digital reconstructions of what it may have looked like. The shrine doesn't exist anymore. So these animations, or these 3D reconstructions are visualizations of what the pilgrims may have seen when they came to Canterbury to worship, to venerate before the shrine of this martyr Bishop Thomas Becket. So in the chapel was the main shrine of Thomas Becket, and in the corona, the circular martyr chapel east of the apse was a separate, smaller shrine for the scalp, the top part of his head that had been cut off. And in the Trinity Chapel are still a string of stained glass windows that show miracles that were reported from pilgrims who had sought and received the help of Saint Thomas. So the window that you see to the left is just one of hundreds of miracles that are recorded that Thomas Becket performed. A dead son of a knight, a knight's son has died from plague, but then is brought back to life by having water of St. Thomas being poured down into his mouth, and that revives him. So what is water of St. Thomas? That is a liquid that is made of St. Thomas' blood that was wiped up from the floor of the cathedral immediately after his murder. The blood was wiped up by his followers and preserved, and water of St. Thomas is a liquid that was made from his blood mixed with water. So that water of St. Thomas was miraculous and very sought after as remedies for when you were sick or ailing. And to the right here you see souvenirs that pilgrims to the church could buy: a pilgrim badge and an ampulla, a very small container made by lead where water of St. Thomas could be filled with water of St. Thomas, this miraculous water that you then could bring home with you if you were in need of yet more miracles. You had recourse to this water of St. Thomas in your little lead ampulla. And St. Thomas, not only the blood of St. Thomas, but also his other parts of his remains, his bones, were distributed from Canterbury to other parts of the Western world. Below, the two pictures below show an enameled reliquary, a casket or a small shrine made in Limoges in France in about 1220. And this shrine was made specifically for relics of Thomas Becket, that we are told that this is so by the scene showing the murder of St. Thomas on the front of this reliquary. It looks as if the attacker is cutting off his entire head, which is not quite accurate because it was just the top of his head that was cut off. And Limoges in France was a center for making enameled works like the reliquary casket. It's made in enamel. It's a gilded copper base decorated with images in enamel. And that was a speciality in Limoges. And the slide here shows you a couple more examples of enameled works from Limoges, enameled objects made in gilded copper, decorated with blue enamels. This beautiful blue color was characteristic of Limoges enamels. So there is to the left, a processional cross or a small cross with a crucified Christ that has been mounted, maybe on a wooden cross to be carried in procession. And the rectangular plaque may have decorated a shrine of some kind. And then there is a Eucharistic dove that held the consecrated host, the piece of bread that was is consecrated in Mass and is transformed into the flesh of Christ. And the dove was a kind of portable tabernacle for the consecrated host. And these kinds of works, enameled objects, were made in large numbers in Limoges in central France. And they spread from Limoges all over Europe. They were an affordable economical alternative to gold and silver objects. And that's exactly the reason why they have been survived in quite large numbers, because they were not attractive in the same way as gold and silver objects to loot and melt down. So they were left alone. There are more than 50 Limoges caskets for Thomas Becket relics alone, and also numerous reliquaries for other saints' relics. And there is even one reliquary, one shrine or casket for St. Thomas Becket's relics in Sweden, in a Swedish church. So works from Limoges traveled as far as all the way up to the Nordic region. Now I keep coming back to relics and reliquaries because it's such an important phenomenon in the Middle Ages, and that is reflected also in art. This is a magnificent example of a shrine. It's the shrine of the Three Kings in the Cologne Cathedral, which is today in Germany, but in Middle Ages it was a French cathedral. And this, we have a name here. This shrine of the Three Kings is a work by the master goldsmith Nicolas of Verdun at the turn of the century 1200. The relics inside were presented to the Archbishop of Cologne by the German emperor, whose name was Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick Redbeard. He gave these relics to the Cologne Cathedral or to the Archbishop in 1164, and they soon became a major attraction that attracted many pilgrims to the cathedral. And on the sides of this huge shrine are images of prophets, Old Testament prophets. On the lower part, images of apostles and evangelists on the upper part. And if we look at the gables, the lower zone of the back gable shows the flagellation and the crucifixion of Christ. These are two episodes from the Passion, the torture and the death of Christ when he was tied to a column and whipped, flagellated, and then crucified. And the upper zone shows the resurrected Christ. And then the front gable That's the kind of main gable, or main face of the shrine. It shows, the top section shows Christ enthroned in the Last Judgment. And then lower left is the adoration of the Magi, or the kings, whose relics were contained inside the shrine. And to the right is the baptism of Christ. And who were these three kings, or the three Magi? They were the wise men who are mentioned in one of the Gospels in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Matthew. The three Magi, three wise men, came from the east in search of the newborn king of the Jews that they had heard of. And in the Gospel, they are called Magi, or wise men. But in the Middle Ages, their identity changed from wise men to kings. And this meant that their relics had an important ideological significance for the Holy Roman emperors, like Frederick Barbarossa and his successors. These relics of the three kings symbolized the divine legitimacy of their imperial power. The authority of the emperor was seen as deriving directly from God. This meant that the emperor answered to God only, not to his representative on earth, which was the Pope. So there was much imperial ideology invested in the reliquary that held the remains of these three kings mentioned that appears in the Gospel of Matthew. So this is the scene, or the lower part of the reliquary. To the left, again, you see the adoration of the Magi, and above you can see how the middle section of the gable can be removed. It's covered by a golden grid that can be removed on feast days, and then the crowned skulls, the relics, the crowned skulls of the three kings become visible. I think I have explained before, earlier in class, that relics generally in the Middle Ages were considered too holy and too powerful to be looked at, to be gazed at. And that was true, but on special occasions they could be put on display, like here, providing that they were still out of reach and protected from direct touch. And this is a close-up of this scene, the adoration of the three kings. They come from the east. They are guided by a star to where Christ, the Christ child, is, and they come with offerings to this newborn king of the Jews that they have heard about. And the crowns, the golden or gold crowns that these three skulls are carrying, they were gifts to the Cologne Cathedral from the emperor, who by then was Otto the Fourth, and he is in fact depicted on this reliquary, on the shrine, standing behind the three kings on the front. So there is one emperor and three kings on the front of this shrine, very much a statement, ideological statement that highlights the divine power that has been invested by God in the emperor. And Otto the Fourth, he died eventually in 1218. He was succeeded in 1220 by Frederick II. And Frederick II, he had a whole series of royal titles that was possible in those times, that he had inherited or because of marriage. So he was king of Sicily, he was king of Germany before he became emperor of Germany, he was king of Germany, he was king of Italy, he was king of Jerusalem. And he led one of the crusades, the Sixth Crusade, that resulted in a temporary, fairly brief return of Jerusalem to Christian control. So he was loaded with titles, and he was admired in his time, not only for all those royal titles, but also for his education and learning. He knew Latin, of course, but he also knew Arabic, and he was a great patron of art and literature and science. So he was an educated man. And he also loved birds. He wrote a treatise, a scholarly study of birds and how to train falcons to hunt with. The original text that he wrote is lost, but his son, whose name was Manfred, recreated it, and Manfred also had it illustrated. We don't know the name of the artist in this case, but he was a real master. His paintings show the birds and their attendants and the various implements and instruments that are used to train these birds, these falcons, to be used for hunting. And these scenes are really extraordinarily lifelike and very accurate, very detailed. And they are explained a bit more in the textbook, what is being shown and the point of these different ways of handling the birds that we can see on the pages are explained by the authors of your textbook. And this entire manuscript with the illustrations can be seen as an expression of a growing interest in the 13th century in observing and depicting the real world and recording the observations in various ways. So the stained glass windows that I showed you earlier in Chartres cathedrals, where we see actual sculptors and carpenters and other craftsmen at work, that is one parallel to this interest taken in the world around us. And the same applies very much to this collection of drawings that are made by a man called Villard de Honnecourt. And his drawings and sketches are also based on close observations of phenomena in the real world, same as the birds in Frederick II's treatise. And Villard de Honnecourt, he introduces himself on one of the pages in this. It's not a bound book, a manuscript. They're bound together today, but originally it's a collection of pages. And on one of these pages, he introduces himself to the reader. He says, here you will find the images of the 12 apostles sitting, and that is exactly what we see on this page. And then he goes on to tell us that Villard de Honnecourt gives you greeting and beseeches all who will work by the aids that are found in this book, who will use the images in the book as models, all who will work by the aids that are found in this book. Villard beseeches all of them to pray for his soul and bear him in remembrance. For in this book one can obtain good advice on the grand craft of masonry and carpentry, and you will find in it the art of drawing and the principal features as the discipline of geometry requires and teaches them. So these sketches and drawings in his portfolio, he made them for his own sake, but he also planned to make them available for others to use, because he addresses the future readers and users of these sketches in his text. And we don't know more about him than this. We have his name because he gives us his name in this introduction, the prologue, and we have the drawings, and that's all we have. Older art historians, they made a big construction out of this and referred to Villard de Honnecourt as an architect. But there are no buildings that we know of that have been built by him. And scholars today, among those who have been studying the drawings of Villard de Honnecourt today, there are some who believe that he didn't really have an understanding, a fundamental understanding of architecture. He has depicted very many buildings, as you can see, and details of buildings, but there are some who feel that his structural understanding is a bit deficient. So he may, in principle, have been an amateur who had a great interest in architecture and noted and copied what he saw, but perhaps did not always understand it the way a builder or an architect would have done. His drawings, is this, yeah. Yeah, these drawings, they show things that he has seen, obviously, on various travels. There are floor plans for buildings, churches. There is a support system, a flying buttress system, upper left for a cathedral. And there is a drawing of a tower of the Laon Cathedral, and exterior elevation in facade structure, interior elevation of the Cathedral in Reims, which is another of the great French Gothic cathedrals. And there are drawings of windows, stained glass, rose windows, and a lot of other things, also mechanical, technical devices, and also drawings of people and of animal. And I have added the address to the web page. This Villard portfolio, Villard on the Cour, is today kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale, the French National Library. And they have a web page where you can browse the entire collection of drawings and sketches by Villard. And he makes a number of studies of human figures, also of saints and crucifixes, like this one. This is Christ who is hanging very heavily on the cross, obviously dying or on the point of dying. In his body, Christ's body is twisted and contorted in a very painful way. The head has fallen to the side. This is the suffering and dying sacrifice in very sharp contrast, you could say, to Christ as the victorious king that we see in the previous art of the previous periods, where Christ, although crucified, is still alive, crowned with a golden king's crown, standing in front of the cross with his feet side by side. The group here is a so-called Calvary group. It is Christ crucified and accompanied by the Virgin to the left and John the Apostle to the right. Such a group is called a Calvary group, and this one exists in the Stave Church Urnes in Norway that I showed you in a previous lecture. It's one of the older so-called Calvary groups that have survived in Europe. The drawing by Villard represent another religious climate, you could say, compared to the Urnes Calvary group. And I will say more about that in a minute, but I will take a break to catch my breath. So stay tuned, I'll be back very soon.